In March 1998, a 2-year-old girl named Emma Gibson vanished from her front yard in rural Oregon in broad daylight. No blood, no footprints, no signs of struggle. Just a plastic toy truck tipped sideways in the grass, and a silence so complete it felt deliberate. The search would last for days. Hundreds of volunteers, helicopters, search dogs, every creek, every field, every abandoned shed within 2 miles. Nothing. Not a single fiber. Not a broken twig pointing in any direction. The answer would take 3 years to surface, and it would come from the trembling voice of a child. Azalea, Oregon sits tucked into the hills of Douglas County, a town built on logging and quietly rebuilding itself without it. In March of 1998, the Gibson family woke to one of those ordinary mornings that give no warning of what they are about to take. Their house sat at the end of a gravel road. Single story, small fenced yard, a swing that tilted slightly to one side. Larry Gibson was 34 years old, a deputy sheriff with Douglas County, steady, clean-cut, the kind of man his colleagues trusted with difficult cases. His wife Judith cleaned the kitchen that morning while the children moved in and out of the living room. The television played softly, a cartoon with bright, cheerful voices. Outside, the creek behind the property murmured over smooth stones. Larry came out to tie his running shoes on the porch. Emma was already in the front yard, blonde curls, bright curious eyes, pushing her yellow toy truck in slow deliberate lines across the wet grass. The yard was barely 20 feet deep. To a toddler, it was an entire world. He watched her for a quiet moment. Judith called from inside that Karen would be out soon to watch her little sister. Larry told his daughter he'd only be gone a short while. 2 miles. His usual route. He checked the gate latch carefully, told Emma to wait for her big sister, and jogged down the gravel driveway. Emma lifted her small hand, still clumsy with baby fat. Her voice carried on the morning air like a bell. Bye, Daddy. Half a mile down the road, Larry slowed. Near the drainage ditch, he spotted movement, a gray cat. The same one that had been tearing through his trash cans for weeks. He'd complained to the neighbors, called the County Humane Society. Nobody ever came out this far into the country. Out here, people handled their own problems. He drew his .45 caliber service pistol, fired once toward the ditch, then holstered the weapon and kept jogging. A minor irritation, answered and forgotten before his next breath. The run took longer than planned. The road dipped into marshy ground, rose toward a ridge where the forest thickened. By the time he turned back and reached his driveway, sweating lightly, his watch read 12:15 in the afternoon. Judith was already on the porch, one hand shading her eyes, her voice sharp and urgent before he even reached the steps. Larry, is she with you? He stopped, still breathing hard. Who are you talking about? Emma. She's gone. I can't find her anywhere. At first, he thought she was mistaken. The yard looked exactly as he'd left it. The swing hung still. The toy truck lay tipped in the grass. The gate stood open, perhaps an inch wider than before. He called his daughter's name. Then louder still. Nothing answered but the wind moving through the trees. He checked behind the porch steps, inside the storage shed, the narrow gap between the fence and the woodpile. Judith ran along the drainage ditch, pushing through the brush, calling until her voice went raw. They circled the house twice. Then Larry grabbed his keys and drove up the road, horn blaring, windows down, shouting into the empty air. He stopped at the first intersection, reversed, came back. Judith was still by the porch steps, crying now, hands shaking. At 12:55 in the afternoon, they called the Douglas County Sheriff's Department. 2-year-old female. Last seen in front yard. Blonde hair, blue eyes. Emma Gibson was gone, and the clock had already been running for nearly an hour. By 1:30 that afternoon, the Gibson property was unrecognizable. Patrol units lined the narrow gravel driveway. A volunteer firefighter from Azalea pulled in behind them. Then neighbors, church members, people from Larry's own Boy Scout troop, strangers who'd heard the call on police scanners. Within an hour, every inch of road near the house was packed with vehicles, and the sheriff's office had set up a command post beside the mailbox. Search dogs came first, a regional K-9 unit trained specifically for missing persons. Their handlers walked them in slow, methodical circles through the front yard, then down the gravel road. The dogs caught a faint scent at the gate, followed it roughly 50 yards, then lost it completely at the curve where the pavement began. Just gone. Like she'd been lifted from the earth. Helicopters from the Oregon State Police swept low overhead. Dozens of men waded through the cold creek, combed through the tall grass, checked under every porch and inside every shed for miles. The afternoon hours bled into one continuous blur of motion and shouting. Judith moved mechanically through the chaos, answering the same questions over and over, pointing again and again to the last place she'd seen her daughter. Larry walked the search perimeter in his running clothes, face completely blank. When deputies asked how long he'd been gone from the house, he said approximately 4 to 5 minutes. They wrote it down without comment. By 4 o'clock, the search grid stretched nearly 2 miles in every direction. Neighbors checked their barns. Firefighters marked cleared zones with orange tape. Teams searched by lantern light long after midnight. They found footprints in the mud, but none small enough to belong to a 2-year-old. Not one shoe. Not one broken twig. Not a single thing to indicate which direction she might have gone. As the sun dropped behind the ridge, hot coffee was passed around in paper cups. Someone offered to drive Judith into town to rest. She refused without hesitation. "She will come back here," Judith said. "She always comes back here when she's scared." Larry went inside briefly and returned wearing his full deputy's uniform. Badge polished. Sidearm holstered. He told a colleague quietly that it felt right, like he needed to look official. Judith didn't answer. She didn't even look at him. When the sheriff finally called a pause at 6 that evening, the volunteers stood pale and exhausted in the fading light. One of them quietly picked up Emma's yellow toy truck from the wet grass and set it gently on the porch railing, as if keeping it safe until she returned. The last vehicles pulled away down the gravel road. Their engines faded into the hills. What remained was wind through the trees, and the soft creak of an empty swing. Inside the kitchen, the table was still set for lunch. Sandwiches untouched on paper plates. Neither Larry nor Judith spoke for a very long time. The next morning brought 100 fresh volunteers and no new answers. Deputies from neighboring towns. Off-duty officers. Church members. Teenagers from Larry's scout troop moving through the brush in straight, coordinated lines, calling Emma's name as though a louder voice might reach wherever she'd gone. Larry moved among the searchers with a clipboard, marking zones, checking off cleared areas. Those who knew him said he looked like a professional doing his job. Those who didn't know him found his composure unsettling in a way they couldn't quite name. One deputy later noted it in his official report. Carefully worded, but unmistakable. Gibson appeared unusually composed for a father in this situation. By the second day, the press arrived. A news crew from Portland filmed the command post. Larry stood in front of the cameras in his polished uniform, answering questions in short, clipped sentences. "We are doing everything we can. Every single minute counts in a case like this." Beside him, Judith stood pale and shaking, unable to speak at all. And somewhere in those hours, the first quiet doubts began to form. Not in the press, not yet, but in the minds of the deputies who had known Larry Gibson for years. The men who wrote things down carefully, who noticed what didn't fit, who kept asking, very politely, about those 4 to 5 minutes. The search continued for days, then weeks. Fields, creeks, abandoned properties, combed again and again by volunteers who kept showing up even after the helicopters were grounded and the command post dismantled. The Douglas County Sheriff's Office expanded the grid, contracted it, expanded it again. Every well, every drainage ditch, every collapsed barn within miles was checked and marked and checked once more. Nothing. The yellow toy truck on the porch railing was the only physical trace of Emma Gibson that anyone ever recovered. As the organized search began to wind down, investigators turned their attention to something quieter and more precise: the timeline. Larry had stated clearly that he left the house at 11:30 that morning. His route, roughly 2 miles round trip through open countryside, should have taken no more than 20 minutes to complete. He claimed he was back by 12:15. Judith placed the moment she realized Emma was missing closer to 12:30. The emergency call to dispatch was logged at 12:55. That left nearly 35 minutes that no one could properly account for. Then came the patrol car. Larry had driven his department-issued sheriff's sedan that morning, a white vehicle with official insignia on both doors. Investigators noted it was highly unusual for an off-duty deputy to use a department vehicle at all. More unusual still was what the odometer showed. 7 miles that appeared in no duty log, with no documented explanation. When asked, Larry said he had driven to a nearby rest area after searching the yard, checking whether Emma might have wandered that far on her own. The sheriff accepted the answer, made a careful note of it, and moved on. But the questions didn't stop there. Days later, during follow-up interviews, Larry admitted he had fired his service weapon during the run. One shot, he said, aimed at a stray cat near the drainage ditch. He had missed. Investigators returned to that stretch of road. They found a grey cat lying dead in the ditch approximately 50 yards from the pavement. 2 bullets. One through the skull, one through the chest. Ballistic testing confirmed both rounds had been fired from Larry's department-issued pistol. He said he'd fired once. He said he'd missed. The evidence said neither of those things was true. One detective captured the problem simply in his notes. People miss their target sometimes. People lie about small things. But rarely do both happen in the same story, with physical evidence to contradict it. By the end of March, the large-scale search was officially scaled back. The helicopters were grounded. Volunteers drifted home to their families. A smaller investigative team took over, working quietly through tip lines, lab results, and re-examined statements. Dozens of sightings came in over the following weeks. A blonde toddler spotted at a highway rest stop. A similar child seen in a grocery parking lot 2 counties away. Each one investigated and dismissed within hours. Then came something that changed the shape of the investigation entirely. 4-year-old Karen Gibson was interviewed by 2 experienced child forensic detectives. Gently, carefully, in a setting designed to put small children at ease. She said she had seen a truck pull into the driveway while her father was out jogging that morning. Inside were a blonde woman and a dark-haired man she didn't recognize. She said they took Emma. She said they drove away quickly and didn't speak to her at all. She described the truck as yellow, or maybe brownish. Older model. The statement was documented word for word. But there were no tire tracks on the gravel from that morning. No neighbors anywhere in the area reported seeing any such vehicle. No trace of it surfaced despite weeks of follow-up. The description was released publicly anyway. Tan or gold pickup truck. 2 occupants sought for questioning. It ran on television, on posters in store windows, in the minds of drivers moving through Oregon highways for months. No such truck was ever found. Inside the sheriff's department, something was shifting. Officers who had worked alongside Larry for years said he'd grown distant, irritable when questioned. When he spoke about Emma at all, his voice stayed completely flat. No grief rising to the surface, no anger underneath it. Just a controlled, deliberate evenness that was starting to unsettle the people who knew him best. The facts refused to sit still. The jogging route that should have taken 20 minutes had somehow consumed nearly 50. The shot that was supposed to miss had struck twice. The patrol car that should have been parked at home had quietly traveled 7 unexplained miles. And through every interview, every question, every long silence in between, Larry Gibson never once cracked. By summer of 1998, the press had moved on. New stories demanded coverage. New missing children filled the headlines. Elia went back to its quiet pace, and the Gibson house, once crowded daily with search teams and volunteers, looked untouched again from the road. Judith stopped giving interviews. She attended church less. She spent most of her time at home with Karen, moving through the rooms of a house that felt smaller every week. Larry returned to work in June. Administrative duty only. Routine paperwork. Limited patrol. Inside the department, the whispers followed him from room to room. One deputy recalled walking into the locker room unexpectedly and finding Larry standing at the mirror, perfectly still, staring at his own reflection for a very long time. When asked how he was holding up, Larry looked over slowly. You just keep doing what you know how to do every day. In July, the sheriff placed him on administrative leave pending further internal review. The department cited emotional distance from the investigation. Larry accepted the decision without protest or comment. No argument. No visible reaction. Just a nod and a quiet exit. Detectives continued their work into fall. They re-interviewed neighbors, re-examined call logs, compared every witness statement side by side looking for contradictions. The ballistics report from the Oregon State Police confirmed what they already knew. 2 bullets, 1 gun, 1 story that didn't hold. But without physical evidence directly connecting those shots to Emma's disappearance, it remained a detail without a destination. In September, a different detective sat down with Judith. She described her husband as increasingly withdrawn, tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. She said she wanted to believe the story about the truck, wanted desperately to believe that someone else had taken her daughter. But when the detective asked whether she trusted Larry's version of events completely, she paused for a long moment. I think he tells what he can live with, she said quietly. Those words went into the report. And they stayed there. By December, the official file carried a single opening line in its final progress update for the year. Investigation ongoing. Subject remains missing. No further developments to report. Christmas came to the Gibson house in silence. Karen asked again and again where her little sister was. Judith told her Emma was with the angels, then caught herself, corrected the sentence, said they were still looking. Larry said nothing during any of it. He simply left the room. In January 1999, he submitted his resignation from the Douglas County Sheriff's Department. The letter was short, typed on department stationery, stripped of everything personal. For personal and family reasons, I am unable to continue my duties at this time. When he left the building for the last time on a gray January afternoon, A few colleagues stood awkwardly near the door. Nobody knew whether to shake his hand. He nodded once, said take care, and walked out into the cold rain. The patrol car he turned in still smelled faintly of disinfectant. That spring, the family left Oregon without announcement. No farewell notice in the local paper. No goodbye from the department or the church. One cold morning, their furniture went into a rented truck, and within a week the house on the gravel road stood completely empty. They relocated 900 miles northeast to a small town near Helena, Montana. A place where no one knew their faces. Where a man could start over without being asked too many questions about where he'd come from. Larry shaved off his mustache. Traded his uniform for pressed dress shirts and ties. Took a job selling insurance. He learned to talk about coverage plans and premiums instead of search grids and missing persons. The local Mormon congregation welcomed them warmly, helped them find a rental house on a quiet street. Larry brought donuts to the men's group. Shook hands firmly. Volunteered at scout events. For a few months, they passed as an ordinary family working through some unspecified hardship. But beneath the surface, the silence inside that house was growing, thicker and heavier with every week that passed. Larry didn't speak about Oregon. When neighbors asked why they'd left, he said only that it had been a hard time for the family. At home, he avoided the subject entirely. Work, church, dinner, television, sleep. A routine so rigid it left no room for anything to break through. Emma's name was never officially banned. It just was never said. Karen was 7 years old, and she still remembered everything. The yellow toy truck. The sound of Emma's laughter in the front yard. The way her little sister said words that weren't quite words yet. Half sounds, half meaning, all warmth. Children are not supposed to carry that kind of weight. But Karen carried it everywhere, quietly, the way small people carry things too large for them, without knowing they have a choice. The nightmares had started not long after they arrived in Montana. She would wake in the dark, crying, insisting she had seen Emma outside the window, standing by the porch, lying on the ground. Judith would sit beside her, brushing her hair, whispering that everything was fine, that it was only a dream, that Emma was safe somewhere. She told herself the same things when the lights went out. One night, Karen woke trembling and said something that stopped Judith cold. "Daddy hurt Emma." The words came out slow and half-formed, tangled in sleep. He put her in the ground. Judith sat completely still. The room felt suddenly airless. She asked Karen gently what she meant, kept her voice low and even, the way you speak to someone standing too close to an edge. But Karen said nothing more. By morning, she didn't seem to remember saying anything at all. Judith did not mention it to Larry. At church, the congregation offered sympathy in the way small communities do, casseroles, dinner invitations, careful questions that never got too specific. People knew something tragic had happened back in Oregon. A missing child, a family undone, a man who had walked away from law enforcement. But the details stayed cloudy, and the Gibsons kept them that way. Slowly, the warmth in the congregation cooled. Conversations stopped when Larry entered a room. The bishop asked him once, after Sunday services, whether he planned to return to police work in Montana. Larry shook his head without hesitation. "That part of my life is over." He didn't mention that the Oregon State Police had kept his file open. He didn't mention that the sheriff who once worked beside him now avoided his calls entirely. By summer of 1999, Judith was pregnant again. She gave birth that August to a dark-haired baby girl they named Lisa, a quiet, easy infant who slept through noise and rarely fussed. For a short window of time, the new baby gave the household something to focus on besides the silence. There were feedings and small routines and the particular exhaustion of new parenthood that crowds out everything else. But the silence was patient. It waited. Larry retreated further into his routine as the months passed. He worked. He drove. He sat by the window in the evenings watching cars move along the road below, the television murmuring in the background. He stopped explaining where he went in the evenings. Judith stopped asking. Their arguments, when they finally came, were quiet and surgical. "You don't talk to me anymore. I talk when there's something to say." After that exchange, she didn't ask again. Karen's drawings had continued through all of it. Crayon figures on notebook paper, tucked into backpacks and under pillows. Most were ordinary. Flowers, houses, stick figure families beneath smiling suns. But one afternoon, while tidying Karen's room, Judith found a drawing tucked carefully beneath the pillow. 4 figures. A man, a woman, a small girl, and another, smaller, drawn in faint gray, lying near the bottom corner of the page. Above them, a yellow sun smiled the way suns always do in children's drawings, oblivious to what was happening beneath it. Judith stood in the quiet of her daughter's room for a long time, holding the paper. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her dresser drawer. She never mentioned it to Larry. There are things you find when you are not looking for them. And once you have found them, you cannot pretend the finding never happened, even when every part of you wants to. By early 2001, the distance between them had become a physical thing. Larry slept on the couch. He claimed the baby's crying kept him awake. Judith didn't argue. She had stopped arguing about most things by then, had learned that silence was easier to manage than the cold, flat responses he gave when pushed. She had also started doing something she hadn't done in years. She had started making plans. Small ones at first. A little money set aside from the grocery budget. A letter to her mother back in Eugene. A mental list of what she would take and what she would leave behind. She moved through these preparations carefully, the way you move through a dark room you've memorized. No sudden gestures, nothing that draws attention. When she finally told Larry she wanted to go back to Oregon for a while, he didn't protest. "Do what you need to do," he said. No anger. No questions. No attempt to understand what she meant by a while. Just those 5 words, delivered with the same flat evenness he applied to everything now. It was the closest he'd come to giving permission in months. In January 2001, nearly 3 years after Emma vanished, Judith packed the car. Clothes, toys, the baby's things. Karen sat silently in the back seat, clutching a stuffed animal, watching the house shrink in the rear window as they pulled away. Larry stood in the driveway with his hands in his pockets, face unreadable as ever. "Take care of yourself," he said. Judith looked at him for a long moment, searching for something familiar, something she might have missed beneath all that control. There was nothing there she recognized anymore. She started the car and drove. The road back to Oregon wound through the same mountain ranges they had once crossed together. Snow still clung to the higher passes. The radio drifted in and out. Karen slept most of the way, her cheek pressed against the cold window glass. When they stopped for gas near Spokane, Judith caught her own reflection in the rearview mirror, pale, older, carrying something behind the eyes that hadn't been there 3 years ago. They reached Oregon after 2 long days of driving. Judith moved in with her mother in Eugene, sharing a small room with the girls. She found part-time work at a laundromat and began rebuilding her life the only way available to her. Quietly, piece by piece, without drawing attention to how much had been lost. Every now and then she thought about calling the Douglas County Sheriff's Office, asking for updates on Emma's case. Each time, she let the thought go. 3 years of silence from that direction had taught her what more silence sounded like. Back in Montana, Larry lived alone in the empty house. He kept it clean, drove to work, attended church less and less. Neighbors described him as polite, distant, a man who seemed only half present, as though the larger part of him was somewhere else entirely. In the evenings, he sat by the window. Sometimes, late at night, he opened a small box he kept in a drawer. Inside were photographs. Emma on her 2nd birthday, a paper hat tilted sideways on her blonde curls. Karen with her first school ribbon. Judith smiling faintly at a picnic from a summer that felt like someone else's life. He looked at them for a few minutes. Then he closed the box and put it away. When the congregation sang hymns about redemption on Sunday mornings, he stood with the open book in his hands and said nothing. Afterward, he shook hands with the bishop and left before the coffee was poured. Nobody in Montana remembered that the Gibsons had arrived as a family. Most people knew Larry only as the quiet insurance agent who kept to himself. Meanwhile, back in Eugene, Karen had started drawing again. The pictures were lighter now, less shadow in the corners, more color overall. But Judith noticed that one figure was always absent. Every family scene, every house beneath every smiling sun, had one figure missing. When she asked Karen about it, her daughter shrugged without looking up from the page. "It just feels right," she said. Judith understood. There are absences that take shape even in a child's hands, that insist on being represented even when no one has given them permission to speak. The file on Emma Gibson sat untouched in the Douglas County evidence room, dust settling along its edge. The case had gone cold in every official sense of the word, but something was still moving. Not in any report, not in any lab result or witness statement. In the half-formed memories of a little girl who could not sleep through the night. The silence finally broke in February 2001. Not through new evidence, not through a confession or a witness or a breakthrough in the lab. It broke the way the most important things often do, through the small, uncertain voice of a child who had been carrying something far too heavy for far too long. Karen Gibson was 7 years old, quiet, watchful, careful with her words in the way children become careful when they have learned that certain words carry consequences. But that winter, something shifted. The nightmares returned with a sharpness they hadn't had before. More vivid, more specific, more insistent. She woke repeatedly in the dark, crying for Emma, telling Judith she could hear Daddy yelling, that she had seen Emma outside, standing by the porch, or lying very still on the ground. Judith held her each time, brushed her hair, said the words that mothers say, but the words weren't working anymore. One morning, Judith found another drawing on Karen's desk. A man in a brown uniform standing over a smaller figure on the ground. Above them, a car with flashing lights on its roof. She stared at it for a long time before folding it and setting it aside. That afternoon, she made a phone call to Karen's school. The counselor's name was Ellen Wright, soft-spoken, experienced with children who struggled to say difficult things directly. She began meeting with Karen weekly, asking gentle questions about home, about family, about what Karen remembered of Oregon before Montana. For several sessions, Karen stayed on the surface. School, friends, the baby, safe answers. Then one afternoon, she went somewhere deeper. She hesitated for a long time, turning the stuffed animal in her lap. Then she whispered something that made Ellen stop writing mid-sentence. That afternoon, Ellen called Judith to the office. Karen sat beside her mother, shoulders tight, eyes on the floor. Her words came out haltingly, assembled from fragments of memory the way a child pieces together a story she was never supposed to tell. Emma followed Daddy outside. A pause. Daddy was mad. He told her to stop. She made a quick motion with her hand, a sharp downward strike. Then quieter, almost inaudible. He put her in the car, the one with the lights. Judith stared at her daughter. The room felt very small. Are you sure? She asked. Karen nodded slowly. Then she said the part that sealed everything. He told me not to tell. He said he would put me in the hole, too. The room went completely still. Ellen Wright documented every word and, following mandatory reporting laws, contacted the Eugene Police Department before the end of the day. Within 24 hours, the file was transferred to Douglas County. The case of Emma Gibson, missing since March 18, 1998, was officially reopened. Detectives arrived at Judith's door 2 days later. They listened carefully as she laid out the full timeline. The move to Montana, the deteriorating marriage, the long silences, the drawing folded in her dresser drawer. When they asked about Larry's temper, whether she had ever seen his control slip, she hesitated. Then she told them what she had spent years minimizing. There had been a chair thrown across the kitchen when Karen spilled juice. A burst of shouting so sudden and violent the baby had screamed for an hour afterward. Small incidents, isolated, each one explained away at the time as stress, as grief, as the particular pressure of carrying something unspoken. She had told herself those things for years. She wasn't sure she believed them anymore. The detectives thanked her quietly. When they left, one paused at the door. We'll need to talk to him. Back in Montana, Larry Gibson was still living alone on Cedar Street. Polite to his neighbors. Reliable at work. A man who waved from the driveway but never lingered. On April 14, 2001, 2 plainclothes officers from Oregon knocked on his door with a warrant for second-degree murder. Larry opened the door, stepped aside. Let them in. I figured this would come eventually, he said. The house was tidy, curtains drawn, sink clean, and on a shelf near the hallway, a framed photograph of Emma, smiling beneath a tilted paper birthday hat, completely unaware of everything that would follow that afternoon. The officers read Larry his rights in the living room of the house he had kept so carefully clean. He didn't resist, didn't raise his voice, didn't ask for time or reach for a phone. He stood and listened as the words were read aloud, then held out his wrists with the same controlled steadiness that had defined every public moment since March 1998. As they led him out through the front door, a neighbor watering her garden across the street paused and stared. Larry met her eyes briefly, nodded once, then got into the car. He was extradited to Oregon within the week. When the news reached Eugene, Judith sat with it alone in the kitchen while the girls slept. The television was off. The blinds were drawn. She had spent 3 years trying to outrun this moment, and now it was sitting right in front of her, solid, unavoidable, nothing like she had imagined it would feel. Not relief exactly, not closure. Something rawer than either of those words. She agreed to cooperate fully with investigators, providing every document and letter she still had from the years in Montana. She also reached out to Larry's half-sister, Debbie Call, who lived in Iowa. Debbie had stayed close to Judith through the separation, though her contact with Larry had ended years before. When Judith told her about the arrest, Debbie went quiet on the phone for several seconds. I think I need to tell you something, she said. Debbie gave her statement to police a few days later. She described a phone call she had received from Larry in the spring of 1998, weeks after Emma vanished. His voice, she said, had been frantic, uneven in a way she had never heard from him before. He said, "I think I killed her." Those were his exact words. She had asked what he meant. He wouldn't explain, said only that it was an accident, that it had all happened too fast. Then the line went dead. Debbie had never gone to the police. At the time, she told herself he was having a breakdown, that grief did strange things to people, made them say things they didn't mean. She had carried that phone call for 3 years, turning it over, wondering. She regretted it now in a way that was difficult to put into words. Her testimony, combined with Karen's statement, gave investigators what they needed. Probable cause. Enough to move. The reopening of the case made headlines across Oregon. The story of the missing toddler from Azalea had faded from public memory, buried beneath 3 years of newer tragedies. But now the name Larry Gibson was back in print, and this time, the words beside it were different. Former lawman. Accused of killing his own daughter. The irony was not subtle, and the press did not treat it gently. Detectives returned to the Gibson property in Azalea, now occupied by another family. They searched the creek again, the old woodpile, the fields beyond the fence line. They pulled archived reports and spread them across tables, reading them with new eyes. The inconsistencies that had once appeared isolated now formed a pattern so clear it was difficult to understand how it had taken this long. The jogging time, the odometer, the ballistics, the composed demeanor, the patrol car, the cat. Each detail alone was explainable. Together, they told a different story entirely. Meanwhile, Larry sat in a county holding cell, calm, as always. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse and shouted questions as vehicles moved past. Through his attorney, he issued a single statement. "I am innocent of these accusations. I have no idea what happened to my daughter." The district attorney held a press conference confirming the charge of second-degree murder. He spoke of new witness testimony and significant corroboration of prior inconsistencies in the original investigation. Old colleagues from the sheriff's department were re-interviewed. Some admitted what they had never said publicly, that even in 1998, something hadn't sat right. That they had wanted to believe Larry because he was one of their own. That the story had never quite fit, and they had chosen not to press it. One deputy remembered the morning after Emma vanished. Larry had come in clean-shaved, uniform pressed, badge polished. When asked if he wanted to take leave, he had shaken his head. No point sitting around. The prosecutors built their case around a single, devastating framework. Not premeditation. Not the crime of a calculating mind planning something deliberate. But a moment of rage, a fatal consequence, and a cover-up so methodical and sustained that it had outlasted a massive search operation, a departmental investigation, a marriage, and 3 years of silence. By the end of April 2001, a grand jury returned an indictment. State of Oregon versus Larry Dean Gibson. Second-degree murder in connection with the death of Emma Rose Gibson, age 2. When the charges were read in court, Larry stood straight, eyes forward, face arranged into the same expression he had worn through every camera, every interview, every long silence since that morning in March 1998. The words echoed off the walls of the courtroom. He showed no reaction. His attorney entered a plea of not guilty. As he was led from the room, someone in the back of the courtroom whispered to the person beside them, "That's the deputy who lost his kid." The other voice was quieter. "Certain. That's the one who killed her." The trial of Larry Dean Gibson opened in September 2001 in Douglas County Circuit Court. It drew the kind of attention that small Oregon towns reserve for events that confirm their worst fears about the people they thought they knew. The courthouse steps filled each morning with reporters and locals who had driven in from Azalea and the surrounding hills. People who remembered the search, who had walked those fields, who had passed coffee cups around in the cold and believed they were helping bring a lost child home. Now they sat in wooden benches and watched the man they had searched alongside answer for what he had done with her. The prosecution's case was built carefully, layer by layer, the way you construct something designed to hold weight. They began with the timeline. The foundational crack in Larry's account that had never been properly explained. The jogging route that should have taken 20 minutes. The watch that read 12:15 when he returned. The dispatcher log that recorded the emergency call at 12:55. Nearly an hour unaccounted for, with no witness, no corroboration, and no explanation that had ever fully satisfied anyone who examined it closely. They moved to the patrol car. 7 miles on the odometer with no duty log entry, no documented route, no verifiable destination. Larry's explanation, that he had driven to a nearby rest area looking for Emma after searching the yard, had been accepted at the time because no one had reason yet to disbelieve him. Now, in a courtroom, it sat differently. A man whose daughter has just vanished does not think to check a rest area a mile down the road. He searches. He calls. He stays close to the last place she was seen. He does not drive methodically to a location and return without leaving a single trace of why he went. Then came the cat. The prosecution walked the jury through the ballistics report with deliberate patience. 1 weapon, 2 bullets, a dead animal 50 yards from the road, and a man who had told investigators, calmly and without hesitation, that he had fired once and missed. The physical evidence contradicted both claims simultaneously. He had not fired once, and he had not missed. 2 shots, both accurate, both fatal. It was a small lie, contained, easy to dismiss in isolation. But the prosecution argued that it revealed something essential about Larry Gibson, that even in minor details, even when the stakes appeared low, he constructed false accounts and maintained them without visible discomfort. If he could lie smoothly about a cat, he could lie smoothly about anything. Debbie Call took the stand and described the phone call from the spring of 1998. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. She repeated the words Larry had spoken into the phone on that late night, weeks after Emma disappeared. "I think I killed her." She said she had asked what he meant. She said he told her it was an accident, that it had happened too fast. Then the line went dead, and she had spent 3 years telling herself it was grief talking, that a broken man had said a broken thing in a broken moment, and that it didn't mean what it sounded like. She looked at the jury when she finished speaking. "I should have called someone," she said. "I know that now." Karen did not testify in open court. She was 8 years old. Her original statement to Counselor Ellen Wright, documented in full and submitted through the child forensic process, was entered into evidence and read aloud by one of the detectives who had investigated the reopened case. The courtroom was very quiet as the words were delivered. Emma followed Daddy outside. Daddy was mad. He told her to stop. He hit her. He put her in the car, the one with the lights. He told me not to tell. He said he would put me in the hole, too. Several jurors looked down at their hands when the reading finished. Judith took the stand for the prosecution on the 4th day. She was composed in the way people become composed when they have rehearsed their own pain long enough to present it without breaking. She described the marriage, the silences, the increasing withdrawal, the chair thrown across the kitchen, the eruption of shouting that had frightened the baby. She described the drive back to Oregon, the snow on the mountain passes, Karen asleep against the window, the rearview mirror showing a face she almost didn't recognize as her own. When the prosecutor asked whether she had ever truly believed the story about the tan pickup truck, Judith paused. "I wanted to," she said. "I needed to, for a long time. But no," she said. "I never believed it." The defense built its case on the absence of a body. No physical remains had ever been recovered. No confirmed cause of death. No crime scene. Without Emma's body, the defense argued, the prosecution was asking the jury to convict a man of murder based on a child's recovered memory, a grieving aunt's recollection of a distressed phone call, and a series of circumstantial inconsistencies that could each be explained individually. Larry's attorney was methodical and composed, qualities that perhaps served him better than they served his client, whose own composure in the defendant's chair continued to unsettle the room in ways that were difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. Larry did not take the stand. Closing arguments lasted 2 days. The prosecution ended with a single image projected onto the screen at the front of the courtroom. Emma Gibson on her 2nd birthday, paper hat tilted sideways on her blonde curls, toy truck in her lap, grinning at whoever was holding the camera. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. The verdict came on a Tuesday morning in late October 2001. Guilty. Second-degree murder. Larry Dean Gibson stood as the word was delivered and absorbed it with the same stillness he had carried through every public moment since March 1998. No collapse. No visible grief. No final crack in the surface. Just the practiced, impenetrable composure of a man who had decided long ago that he would not be seen breaking. The courtroom exhaled around him. Outside, on the courthouse steps, reporters clustered around anyone willing to speak. Former colleagues from the sheriff's department stood in small groups, not quite looking at each other. Several of the original search volunteers were there. The people who had waded through the creek in the cold, who had called Emma's name into the dark fields, who had carried flashlights through pine forests for days convinced they were helping. Now they stood in the October light trying to locate some version of this ending that made sense alongside all of that. Most of them couldn't. In Eugene, Judith heard the verdict by phone. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of her. When she hung up, she stayed at the table for a long time without moving. Karen was at school. The baby was asleep. The house was quiet in the particular way that feels different from ordinary quiet. Weighted, specific, the silence of something finally finished. She had been asked by several reporters in the weeks leading up to the verdict whether a conviction would bring her closure. She had found the question almost impossible to answer. Closure implied a door swinging shut on something. But Emma was still gone. There was no grave to visit. No confirmed final resting place. No body ever recovered despite searches that had extended across multiple counties and 3 years. The conviction told her what had happened in the broadest possible terms. It confirmed what she had known and refused to know simultaneously for 3 years. But it did not tell her where her daughter was. It did not give her anything to hold. At sentencing, Larry received 25 years. He stood for the sentence the same way he had stood for everything else. Straight, composed, eyes forward. His attorney spoke briefly about mitigating factors, about a man who had served his community faithfully for 12 years, about grief and circumstance and the limits of what the evidence actually proved. The judge listened without visible reaction, then delivered the sentence in measured, unhurried language. When they led Larry Gibson from the courtroom for the last time, several people in the gallery watched his back as he moved through the door. A deputy who had worked alongside him for 6 years said afterward that what struck him most was not the verdict or the sentence or even the crime itself. It was that Larry never once looked back. The case entered the public record as one of the most quietly devastating in Douglas County history. Not because of its scale. There were no dramatic revelations, no sudden confessions, no recovered evidence that cracked the case open in a single moment. It moved slowly, the way real things move, through accumulated detail and the reluctant testimony of people who had waited too long to speak. Emma Rose Gibson was 2 years old. She had blonde curls and bright, curious eyes and a yellow toy truck she pushed in slow, deliberate lines across wet grass. She said bye, Daddy on a March morning in 1998 and was never seen again. Her body was never found despite years of searching. The land around Azalea kept it secret, as land sometimes does, indifferent to what has been buried inside it. Karen Gibson grew up carrying what she had seen, holding it through childhood in Montana and nightmares and drawings and a courtroom process she was considered too young to participate in directly. The testimony she gave at 8 years old, halting and careful and devastating, was the testimony that reopened the case. Without it, the file might have stayed closed indefinitely. The dust would have continued settling along its edge in the evidence room, undisturbed. She spoke when she was ready. And when she spoke, it changed everything. Judith rebuilt her life in Eugene with the particular determination of someone who has decided that survival is its own form of resistance. She rarely spoke publicly about the case after the conviction. In one of her last recorded statements to a journalist, she said something that stayed in the coverage for years afterward. I spent a long time waiting for someone to tell me what I already knew. I think I was waiting for permission. You don't need permission to trust what you feel in your own bones. The house on the gravel road in Azalea changed hands twice in the years that followed. The swing was eventually taken down. The wooden fence was replaced. New families moved through those rooms, filling them with different sounds and different mornings. The creek behind the property kept moving over its smooth stones, the way water does, carrying nothing forward and leaving nothing behind. But in the town's memory, in the minds of the people who had walked those fields and called that name into the dark, something remained that could not be searched or mapped or officially cleared. A small girl in a front yard on an ordinary morning. A yellow toy truck tipped sideways in the grass. And the particular silence that follows a voice that will not come back.